Okay, welcome to another session of the Skull Sessions. This is with author John P. Wallman, and we're gonna have a little discussion over what he has going on right now and how his career progressed to this point. So, John, tell me, what are you working on?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be a part of your show. And I've been actually paying attention to a lot of your podcasts here recently. So you've had quite a few interesting people on in the last month or so. So I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I try
What
to
I'm
have a
work,
variety.
yeah, what I'm working on right now is this second book of my Dark Matter series, The Dark Gambit. The first book came out last June, and it's been a slow and steady sale on that. But I'm in it for the long run, so I'm not entirely concerned about sales and all that kind of stuff. I just want to try to get this story written, so to speak. But the second book's title is The Dark Gambit. Um, it's the second of four books. The third book is The Dark Harvest, and the fourth is The Dark Angel. And I have all of The Dark Harvest drafted. So that's the third book, and part of the fourth book drafted. So I'm going back now, and I'm into the second revision of The Dark Gambit, the second book, and that'll go back and forth between me and my publisher a couple more times before we do a total rewrite. Um, and a lot of people ask me, well, what's the difference between revision and rewriting? And this is just me, because a lot of different writers will have their own definitions of those terms. But this is how I kind of defined it for me. A revision for me is when I stay in the text and make changes in the text that my publisher just sent back to me. So she'll have her comments and suggestions and deletions and things like that. And then I'll just stay in the text and make those changes and make my own additions and subtractions to the text itself. Then I'll send that back to her, and then she'll send it back to me. But at some point when we're kind of satisfied with the overall story and its progression, I'll actually get a blank document and actually physically rewrite from word one to word 100,001, or however many words it ends up being. And that is what I kind of consider a rewrite. I actually have the two documents on the desktop, and I'll just basically go from one to the other, and rewrite word for word that entire document. And what ends up happening, or at least what I discovered in the first book, was I ended up adding probably about 2,000 to 3,000 more words as I expanded some descriptions and things like that. So that physical rewrite at the end really helps out fleshing things out that I personally just find those little holes in that physical rewrite that I need to kind of fill in or flesh out a little bit. So we're looking at some point for the Dark Gambit this summer, to get that rewrite started and get it on the path to publication. So that's kind of like where things are going right now. Also, I'm in the middle of a shorter piece called Tales of a Dark Sun, which happened to be preludes and interludes and postludes that I had taken out of earlier drafts of the Dark Matter series, and my publisher wanted me to put those on Kindle Vella.
Sort of like related short stories.
Yeah, well, Kindle Vella is an interesting platform in that it's a serialized platform. So you might have a short story, but each part of it It can be anywhere from 500 to 6,000 words. That's like the parameters for each part. And it's a serialized format. I've seen some people put together a series of short stories on there that are related to each other. Mine is actually kind of like more, I'm treating them more like chapters. So I already have one story on Vela called The Long Shadow of Rising Night, which was a prelude to the first book, The Dark Stirs, that my publisher had me take out. But she liked it so much, she said, hey, try this platform, throw your story on there, and people who are interested in the series can check out a little past history, some episodes that occur before the actual story of The Dark Stirs, which is book one. So I threw that on there. That's actually my first paycheck came from Kindle Vella after I had published The Long Shadow of Rising Night. I ended up, because you have to buy tokens to open up each subsequent chapter. I think the first three are free, and then anything after that, you have to use a token to open up a chapter. So, so that was my first money made from writing. So I considered myself an author after that.
So if your editor or publisher liked it so much, why did they want to exclude it from the novel?
Well, first of all, the first novel, the first early drafts of the novel were right around 165,000 words. So that was just way too large a book for a first time author. So I had a lot of these preludes and interludes and postludes to each part of the story. And she felt that she just wanted me to focus on the two main protagonists, and all the ancillary stuff were interesting, but they kind of, for her, detracted from the story of John Paul and Angelique. And that's what she wanted me, at least in this first book, to focus on those two characters alone. And all these postludes are kind of tangent to that story, but not necessarily important for the development of those two characters and what happens with them in the first book, The Dark Stirs. So I had to. It was like having surgery on your child, and doing the surgery yourself. I had to look really hard at those ludes, as I call them, and ask myself, how important is this? How important was knowing what happened to Angelique's father when she was 10 years old, to the point in this story where she's in college. I allude to it a good bit in the book, but what actually happens to her father, Ben Carlson, really, even though it's interesting, really wasn't that important to the story that is contained within The Dark Stirs. So there were some hard decisions I had to make, but I have to be honest, and she was right. Lexi Moni is her name. She was right in that they are interesting, but they're
What's
not.
your publisher's name?
The Courage Publishing.
Okay.
And they're a little indie publisher out of Michigan. But yeah, so it was difficult for me to swallow at the time, but once that draft was completed and I read through it beginning to end, I had to admit to myself that having those other ludes in there weren't really important to the flow of the story. And they did, and a couple of them did. You have your narrative, and then all of a sudden you're coming out of it to have this interlude, then you're going back into the narrative. I'm going this way. And she was right. And I had to admit to myself that, they are interesting stories and we're going to put them on Vela, or we may actually publish them separately in the future. But right now I'm going to be putting them on Vela, and people who are interested in other tales of the Dark Matter series can find those on Kindle Vela under my name.
You said that they found 165 words to be too extravagant for an early novel. Was there a
Right.
page count they were looking for?
I think she didn't really give me a page count per se, but that's a good question. I think mm, I think she didn't want a 700 to 800 page tome, and the cost associated with that, for a first time author. Um, 350 to 400 words is an adequate amount that keeps the cost down. All these were questions and things that I hadn't even considered. I just wrote the story, and had this huge, long, intricate story that I kept putting out to different literary agents and such. Kept getting rejected until Lexi came along and took a risk. But I had to make a lot of changes to it, and it ended up being a slightly different story than I had originally started off with. But I'm very happy with it, and it ended up being um, a better and tighter story than what it was before.
That the completely rewriting thing, that like most people don't do that. Like what I'll do is I'll do like a heavy edit, like I'll read it and I'll have some beta readers and I'll get some feedback on it, and then
Right.
I'll read through it again, and I might add whole chapters or delete like a paragraph or whatever, but I don't physically sit down and rewrite it. I mean, I did once when I lost my flash drive, so I lost all the original info. So I had to rewrite it. But I mean,
Yeah,
in
I've
general,
been
I
there.
don't rewrite it. What made you
She
arrive at that process?
she suggested it. Lexi said to me, she goes, I want you to try this. At least do part one. If you don't feel it's that important, or if you find that you're not really making any changes, or if it's just a kind of a waste of time, that you're just basically word one, word two, word three transfer, and that's all you're doing, then we'll stop. We'll have a chat, talk about it, and then go from there. But almost from the first few pages, I ended up making little changes here, adding the little description there, rearranging some of the dialogue, and it ended up being a complete edit. And then I sent that to her, and she was happy with it. And then we sent it to an editor who actually tightened up everything. And I have to give out a big shout out to Cheyenne Sampson, my editor, because when she sent it back to me and I started looking at it, I'm like, what did she do? She didn't do anything. I mean, why did we pay her to do this? And it was only after I got halfway through reading the manuscript that I pulled out the earlier draft, the draft before, and started comparing the two. And there was, I mean, literally hundreds of little micro changes that she had made in punctuation, a couple words here and there. I mean, every page had some kind of a little micro change on there that was so subtle that I didn't even notice. Being the writer myself, I didn't even notice it. That was how good she was. She was very careful about keeping my tone and my
Yeah, I think
style
that's the best
intact.
editors, because like some like they're just frustrated writers. So if you give them something, they want to rewrite it in the voice they would write it in. Well, the
Yeah,
best editors do that. They do, like, instead of saying he was wearing a red shirt, or a shirt that was red, just saying who's wearing a red shirt. So it's like a minor like deletion of a couple words that just makes it flow better.
Yeah, and that's what she did. I was because at first I was like kind of irritated. I was like, she hasn't done anything. I mean, what is this? And then when I looked at it more closely, I was like, holy moly, she she polished it was like it was definitely like a dull ornament that she had polished to make it into this beautiful thing to put on your bookshelf or whatever. And I was extremely impressed with it. And I told Lexi, it's like we have to get her for all the books, no questions asked. I don't care what happens with what's going on in anyone's life. We have to make sure we get Cheyenne to do all the books because that's how good she was. So
Well, all
shout
the
out.
editors that I've used so far, my favorite is Carl Monger. He's edited all of my novels. What they do is they'll edit, like, say, a chapter, and when they send to you, they'll have like what they want to delete highlighted in red. Like it's still there, but it's highlighted in red, and then in gold, they'll have what they're replacing it with, and they might have like little notes on the side, so you can see step by step everything
Right.
that they're doing.
I wasn't given that. Lexi didn't send that to me. What she did, if I recall correctly, she went ahead and took that manuscript and formatted it into a document that would eventually become the document for printing. And so I didn't get to see all of the tracking notes and everything. I see all of hers when she sends me the drafts back during the revision process. I see all of her notes and questions and comments and suggestions, but I didn't see anything from Cheyenne. I just saw this pre-document, a pre-publication document, and I mean, and then it eventually became the actual document that was used for publication. So I didn't really see all those little tracking changes and such. I just started reading through it, and I was expecting to see different words and and there was that, but I just saw this document that looked like my old document, and I'm like, what's going on here? And it was only when I did the side by side change comparison that I was like, holy moly, I couldn't even, every page had some little change, and there were all little subtle changes, but they added up to this amazing edit. I mean, I just, however she learned how to do that, I was impressed. And I'm an English teacher by I was an English teacher for 20 years or roughly 20 years. And I kind of prided myself in the fact that my diction and vocabulary level was adequate enough for a decent level reader, high score or higher. But she improved things. I was flabbergasted. It was just amazing what she did with my words and twisting some things around a little bit that didn't detract from my voice and my style and it was just amazing. I wasn't aware that I could have someone sound like me and make me sound better. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So,
definitely. I mean, it's a different medium, so it's like you learn to translate your skills into the medium. Like, for instance, I went to art school. I wanted to be a comic artist. Now I own a tattoo shop. But just because you can draw well and you can paint well doesn't necessarily mean you can tattoo. Like, of course, art skills translate, but you have to
right.
learn the medium. So probably commercial editors like my guy Carl Monger, he does a lot of stuff that's like in the fiction and science fiction horror genre. So he's kind of like used to the little ticks and what works best for like longer tomes in the marketplace.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I I had figured since we gone through so many revisions and then the rewrite, and I found all kinds of little issues during the rewrite, that 98% of everything was done. And I was almost going to suggest to Lexi that you not even worry about an editor because I was that confident in it until I made that comparison. I was like, well, I'm not going to trust myself anymore. I'm going to trust the editor because she was just amazing. So
Well, I'm sure she does that for a living, so she has
yeah,
years
yeah,
of experience doing
right,
that.
right, and and I think that's the big difference between self-publishing and traditional publishing is if you don't have a really good editor or someone who can find a really good editor for you, there are, you know, the writer is so close to the child, so to speak, that you can't see the flaws at all, and you need that third, or in this, well, I guess third party, beyond me and Lexi, that third person to say, yeah, you both did a really good job, but look at this.
Well, unfortunately, it's a mixed bag. It's like I have a recent story that was accepted for an anthology, and the first I signed off on everything, and then the publisher decided to give it an extensive edit. In the edit, he basically tried to change the tone into the way he would write the story. I was like, yeah, I'm gonna have to say no. You know,
Yeah,
but yeah, it's like I said, it's a mixed bag, and it might also be a mixed bag if like the publisher is also the editor.
right, right. Well, and and initially Lexi was kind of like an editor. She made all these suggestions. I didn't agree with all of them, and I didn't do them all either. But in the long run, when it came to that polish at the end, um, having that outside person take a fresh look at this document and be respectful to what had happened before, especially to
The
me.
original content
Yeah,
and yourself telling the story in your voice and
right.
so on.
I mean, it was Cheyenne was uh, I was, I sent her a note not long after I read through that, and I was like, and explained to her what, how I had felt about things before and after the final reading, and I told her flat out, you are amazing, and she is, and Cheyenne Sampson's her name, everyone. So if you're looking for a great, fantastic editor, who one who will have deep respect for you as an artist and as a writer, Cheyenne Sampson's the person to find. So she's on Facebook. But
I think
yeah,
having
so,
a quality editor is one of those things that like people don't realize how good it is until they have one. Like they're like,
right.
oh yeah, it reads great, and then the editor just polishes it up, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my god, it's so much better.
Yeah, and that was exactly the case. I was extremely shocked at all the micro changes that she had made that I didn't even notice. I didn't even see them until I made that side by side comparison, and I was like, "Holy moly! What did she do? How did she do this?" It was amazing. So yeah, so that's basically the kind of the process I went through for the Dark Stirs, this whole revision, rewriting thing that I had done, and it was all basically what Lexi, my publisher, suggested I do, and basically that's what we're going to do with the Dark Gambit. As I'm working through that, I'm about 2/3 of the way finished with the second revision to the Dark Gambit.
Let's talk about the meat of the story. Like you know, what would you if you're trying to get people interested and you're pitching it to people? what would you tell them about it? What would you tell them that it was unique, that it was like enticing?
It's a it the whole Dark Matter series, because I had 2/3 to 3/4 of the entire, I'll say 2/3 of the entire series written before Lexi picked it up. And that first book, the first version of the first book, The Dark Stirs, was around 165,000 words. So we ended up chopping off the last third of that, the last part of that book, and pushing that into the second book, to make The Dark Stirs a shorter book. So I cut out all those lewds, and then I took off that part, the third part of that book, and we ended up making a trilogy into a 4-book series, and a quartology, or whatever you want to call it. And that shaving off that last part of the book and pushing into the second book totally changed the whole nature of the first book, because it was more of a dark fantasy at that particular point. And a lot of the fantastical elements that were in that final part that now is going to be in the second book.
What's the premise of the story? The beginning premise, at least.
Okay, so the first book right now, as opposed to what it was before, the first book is basically a vampire thriller. You have two protagonists, one for light and one for darkness. The protagonist for light, his name is John Paul Wilkins, and I'll get to that in a minute. He is basically your average Joe, average guy, average life, mundane world. He's happy with how his life is going, and he doesn't really have a care in the world until this young woman named Angelique Carlson comes into his life. And she is the protagonist for darkness. She is a bit of a coquette. She knows she's beautiful and uses that to her advantage. She has this history with what she calls shadows in her life. And that's getting a little bit into the fantasy aspect of the story. But they more or less kind of leave her alone, and everyone thinks that she's basically a little, nutsy anyway. Until those shadows manifest themselves into something that attacks her. And John Paul's the person who kind of saves the day. He's not entirely certain how he does it, but he does it. I don't want to necessarily get into the details of it here, but so you'll have to go read the book. But he saves the day. They kind of fall in love, and they have this toxic relationship. So you have this toxic relationship. You have this idea of shadows. Angels come into play in the story. Assassins come after John Paul, trying to
Are the angels affiliated with any religion? Do you have
it's a very Christian story. I do pull on elements of Jewish mythology and some Mesopotamian mythology later on in the series, but there is talk of God and Christ and heaven. So it is a kind of that does have a heavy Christian element to it. And that's because I was brought up Catholic for most of my life. It's not as religious as it originally was in the early drafts, but religion does play a part in the story. And at the end of the story, John Paul is saved from the assassins and taken to the Vatican, because he comes to find out through the angels that he's been chosen to rid the world of a growing darkness that will threaten to swallow everything that is good and light and joyful in the future. So he survives all the ordeals that are thrown at him. Angelique, on the other hand, embraces the darkness that is kind of growing within her, finds this attacker that had tried to kill her early in the novel that John saves her from, and discovers that this person is not really a person, but an actual vampire. And so you have this whole idea of the supernatural force in her life, the supernatural forces in John's life. And the first book kind of sets up the rest of the series, in that that these two are going to be champions of light and darkness, and end up button heads a few times throughout the series until the end. So
is that like a regular guy who becomes more or less a vampire? Is that kind of the premise of all the novels? Like, do they flow through continuously?
Well, John doesn't become. He's the champion of light. So there's a third party in this story. His name is Anders, and he's the dark part of the story that is stirring the whole light and darkness together to get them to come to this final conflict in the Dark Angel in the fourth book. But he's not alone in his machinations. There's a whole organization of darkness throughout the entire world that John has to try to avoid and navigate until he comes into his own kind of power at some point in the third book. So you have this average guy who has a toxic relationship with this of strange, beautiful but dark woman, and they have to try to navigate their way through that. They go their separate ways, but then the reader starts to see how they're ending up just kind of coming together at the end, and you'll see that in the second book, in the Dark Gambit, where they do meet up a little bit and have a little chat or two about light and darkness, and how they are the heroes of their respective sides.
So it's kind of a series, like each book like basically picks up where the last one left off and like develops the story further.
Exactly. I mean, it's actually one long story that's just been divided into 4 books. So there's very little. It takes place over a relatively short period of time, roughly from March 2007 into June of 2008. And there's a reason for that it ends at that particular time. And again, I don't want to give too much away on that, but it's just one. When the action starts happening in the middle of the second book, you start to see light and darkness having starting to throw their powers around. The angels come into play. The vampire comes into play. From that particular point on, it's a roller coaster ride. So a lot of people have been, and by the way, the reviews on Goodreads and Amazon have been very good. We're 4.8, I think, at Goodreads, 4.9 on Amazon. But anyway, the relationship between John Paul and Angelique is very toxic, and at some point, some people have even said, I was hoping they would split up, because the way they were treating each other is terrible, and that's because of all these dark forces in Angelique's life that have manipulated her in her entire life to become this kind of bitter, sarcastic, biting kind of person that um, almost brings John down. And fortunately, he rises above it, and they break up and go their separate ways. But the reader will know very quickly that these two are not done with each other. So,
Do you think because there's maybe because there's a strong religious element, do you temper any of like the violence or the sex or the the language or anything like that?
no, well, no, the language is yeah, it's an adult story. Yeah, there's it's not for and it's not for the faint of heart, because the toxic relationship between those two is I had actually I was told by my publisher to tone down the adult themes, because they could have been triggering. And I don't know if I want to say anything more than that, because I the for me personally, I found writing that toxic relationship very that was probably one of the best parts for me, was figuring out how these two are going to play off each other in their
One of the
relationship.
strongest elements of the story.
For me, for other people have found from that particular point on to be the stronger part. With Anders the vampire coming into play and all of that. I think people going into the story are expecting a vampire story from the get-go, and it starts off a little bit like that, but then you get this dark dance between John Paul and Angelique, and how they navigate through their way through that. And then once they separate and go their separate ways, then all of a sudden the story starts to take off from there. And the part that I found most fun to write, which was that toxic relationship. Some people have it's very dark, and the guy, John, you want to root for him, but he does some as there's darkness in all of us, and sometimes we yield to that darkness and do things that we shouldn't have done or are ashamed of, but it's done, and you have to kind of deal with that. And she brings out the worst in him, and he plays with that a little bit until he realizes that's not him, and that she's not good for him. Even though he loves her dearly, he realizes that she doesn't love him back in the same way, and that she loves something more, and that's this pursuit of this darkness that's inside of her. She wants to explore that, and he won't go on that journey with her. And come to find out that he'll end up going on that journey with her anyway, but in a different way.
So if your publisher was asking you to tone it down a little bit, what attracted you to that publisher in the first place?
Wow, that's a good question. So when I first started all of this, I had this kind of image of using my two kind of favorite movies. I wanted to do something like a vampire Highlander. So I was going to have this vampire who told his stories in these flashbacks.
Well, you said two. What's the other one?
Well, I'll get that. So I wanted this vampire Highlander, but then that's already been kind of done. And so in my search to try to tell a vampire story in a different way, I also wanted to bring in like some body horror. This whole like Hellraiser. I loved the movie Hellraiser. Um, and I wanted to touch on some elements of that kind of body horror. And in the very first draft, there was a lot of hypersexual situations that I'm ashamed to say that I enjoyed writing. So, um, but I shouldn't say that though, because the story is what the story is.
Well,
And
also sexuality is a part of humanity. I mean,
oh,
people might
true,
have
yeah,
their, subjective perspectives on, how it's portrayed and how it's used and so on. But it is a part of humanity.
right, and in all of its forms, and consequently, in those early drafts, I kind of let myself. I didn't hold back. I wrote some very um, hypersexualized episodes that people who read some of those early drafts were, they're like, John, I didn't realize you had this kind of edge to you. You never portray that in real life, and it's like, well, that's the magic of writing, is that you can actually be someone else if you want, and I
Well,
let
I
myself
think people love
go.
the stereotype too. It's like if you listen to certain type of music, you must be that way. But
Right.
you could be totally like you're listening to gangster rap, but you're like a white guy in the suburbs that works at Office Max.
Yeah. So, I I knew even then that I was writing just for me. It wasn't really writing to think about being published. I just had this story that I wanted to tell, and it kept evolving and changing. And when I went back and then did my own kind of rewrite of it, um, other characters started becoming more and more important, and that initial relationship I had between John and Angelique, um, did they ended up becoming a little bit older, a little more mature in the story, and that whole sexual situation that I had with them earlier uh, didn't really seem that important. It wasn't that part of their relationship wasn't that important. But even when I rewrote it and wrote some of that out, when Lexi picked it up through Courage Publishing, she's like, "Well, you know, this is going to really limit your audience if you keep this in there." Um, and so we talked a lot about that. We talked a lot about what to leave in, what to take out. Um,
But you
there's
know that a
still,
lot of times when Hollywood is pretty famous for doing that with directors, for instance.
yeah, yeah,
So if you see the director's cut, it's usually a way better movie than the version the Hollywood puts out. But they convince them you have to take this out, you have to take that out. For like my first novel, it's like it's mainly an apocalyptic horror story with like a tiny, tiny bit of sci-fi in it. But I had one cover for it, and the publisher at the time convinced me, he's like, you got to put a sci-fi cover there. I'm like, why? We have a tiny bit of sci-fi. He's like, oh, but that means the sci-fi people will buy it. And people who like horror, speculative fiction, they'll buy it anyways. And so I didn't know anything, and so I went with him.
right.
Later on, it was republished with the original cover, and it sold way better. So that seems to be like a Hollywood publisher, whatever thing, where like
Right.
they want to put you in a box.
Well, I think she felt though, and and I kind of have to agree with her that that early draft would have actually put the book itself into a box. Um, and if I wanted to make this more accessible to a wider audience, then I was going to have to, one, uh, re-examine John Paul's and Angelique's relationship, um, and make it less about sex and more about the demons that are driving their relationship, making it toxic. So initially, it was the sex. It was her hypersexualized and twisted desires, and John, being this average guy, had a difficulty dealing with him, and uh, I kind of switched from a sexual kind of dysfunction more into a kind of soul dysfunction, is dysfunction of the heart. And that's because of these shadows that were in her life that had been twisting her and manipulating her nearly her entire life, unbeknownst to her until a little bit later in the story, when she realizes that she's never had any choices in her life, that she's been totally manipulated since the death of her father, which is what basically the story, The Long Shadow of Rising Night, is about on Kindle Vella. So, um, it's, what do? You kind of have to trust, in some cases, the person that you're going to be handing your book to, because they have more experience with the publishing audience aspects than you, the writer, who is basically just in it to tell the story. All this stuff with publishing, I've had to learn, concurrent to the whole writing process for The Dark Stirs. I don't think anybody can actually tell you. You can read about it in a book. I have 2 or 3 books on the shelf behind me about publishing, and how to get published, and what you need to consider for being published. But I think it's more of an experiential thing. It's something that I was not prepared for. This whole collaborative process. Naively, and probably many first-time authors are probably in the same boat. I hope so, but I'm not the only person. But naively, I thought, I'm just going to write this story, hand it to you, Lexi, or you, publisher, or whomever, and you guys work your magic on it. I'm going to get back to writing book 2.
Yeah, no,
And
that's what I thought. It's like
yeah,
I thought the hardest thing would be actually writing it, but the hardest thing is actually to get someone to pick it up and publish it.
right.
But
Yeah,
I think a lot of what the publisher wants changed. I've learned over the course of, I've been through 5 different publishers at this point, and I've learned that it's kind of like more subjective what they want changed, because they're thinking just about their market and how best they're going to sell it. So I find the best advice I get are from beta readers, so
yeah,
they're the people that actually purchase that kind of material, and they'll give me their realistic feedback on it. They won't think about how's this going to sell. So I
right.
think every time you think how's it going to sell, that's how we end up with like 20 million Nirvana clones, or 20 million, Alice in Chain clones, or
Yeah,
people try to they try to copy what will sell, not what's a good story.
right, right. I don't think, Lexi wasn't so much wanting to change the story for the story's sake.
Well, I'm not throwing her under the bus. I'm just
Oh
saying,
no, and I'm not either. I'm just saying she made all kinds of suggestions, and just basically said, think about it. Think about, is this necessary? Think about the whole story, not just The Dark Stirs, but all the other books, and the whole arc of the story, and just think about these questions. Is this necessary?
no, that's a good approach. I mean,
If you took it out, is it going to change anything in the overarching thread of the story? And I have to admit that 85% of her suggestions were good suggestions. And, you know, when you have a hyper complex sort story that I had initially with all these references to different time periods and different uh, ancillary or tangential issues, the book, when it comes down to it, and actually the whole series for that matter, when it comes down to it, is about John Paul Wilkins and Angelique Carlson. That's it. And once I came to that conclusion, after I was gently manipulated into that conclusion, um,
Well, were you
all the
manipulated or just talked into it? Because I mean, there are people that are like, "That's the strongest thing. You should focus on that." So that's talking me into it. If they're like, "No, I
well,
really think,"
it you know manipulation or guide or what, I mean, whatever you want. Manipulation might be a strong word, but um, I think she wanted me to really think about who and what the story was about, and it's about those two people. And all the other stuff is interesting, and I had fun researching and writing it. I hope, and it probably will show up somewhere else in a different format. But is it necessary for the story of those two people? No. And that was a hard pill for me to swallow. And because like I said before, it's like doing surgery on your child. I mean, I this is my child, and you want me to cut it up? Um, it was difficult at the beginning, and that's one of the things I was not prepared for as a first time writer. This whole collaboration process for getting published, and I don't know that you can learn that. You have to kind of experience it, and um,
we'll learn by experience. Yeah,
or
learn by
learn through experience.
repetition.
It's not something that you can read about. I can read all the books about being published, but when you're dealing with that person, that publisher, one on one in a Zoom call, or looking at her notes in your text, and part of you wants to rebel, and the other part is like, you know, she's taking a risk on you too. You need to listen to her. And once I got over that hurdle, and it was easy to basically figure out what parts were inherently important to the story and which parts weren't. And I have to hand it to the wisdom of Lexi Money that she, nearly all of the parts that she suggested that I take out and then rewrite and see if it was necessary to have that in there. Nearly all of them were in fact not necessary, and I have to hand it to her. She made the book a better book by me taking those out and expanding other parts of the story, especially in that toxic relationship, that that part of the story, that it fleshed things out and made it a lot smoother story, and it just focuses on those two people. Now, the second book, there are some characters who come into play that are that will expand the points of view a little bit, because as the series progresses, it becomes less about these two people and mostly about the two forces that those two people are the heroes of, are the champions of. And so you have a lot more characters come into play later on. You'll get their points of view a little bit. But it is primarily still, from beginning to end, a story about John Paul Wilkins and Angelique Carlson. And that's how it'll end up being till the very end. I know how the very end is going to end. I know the fact
Do you
that
already have kind of a rough draft of the entire story in your head?
oh yeah. not that I stay to it, but I know I've known almost from halfway through the first book when I was writing the first book, and certain other characters started coming into play that um, there are other important forces that will be introduced as the series progresses, and that those other forces, those other characters have told me where the story is going to go and how it's going to end. I know the exact last sentence of the book. Now, what happens between now, where I am now, and that last sentence is a different matter. But I have roughly most of the major events of the story, at least outlined or thought about, put on paper. Whether those actually occur or not as I'm writing it is a totally different issue, because the story itself is a very organic story. It evolves as I'm writing it. So we'll see what happens. And that's kind of like the fun of it too. As you're writing, if you don't adhere, I don't have a outline on my desktop, and I'm looking at 1A1, and I'm saying, okay, how am I going to put those 3 lines of the outline into my story? That's not what I do. I have a thrust of the story. I know where it's going. How it gets there is sometimes a surprise. And that's what makes writing all this interesting for me, at least. So.
Well, everybody has a different method. I mean, some people like that hard outline where they delineate the entire thing from beginning to end and every, development. And some people take notes and they try and incorporate those notes. They have kind of a loose idea of where it's going. And some people, in the term I've just heard recently, are called pantsers, which is
Right.
by the seat of the pants. They just like bang it out. And it could go anywhere. It depends on how they feel when they sit down to write that day.
Right.
What approach do you take?
I think I started off as a pantser this whole thing because I didn't quite know where it was going. But once certain characters started to come into play, and I started researching that time period, and that time period being ancient Mesopotamia in the time of the great city of Uruk, which is in southern Iraq.
Is that part of the backstory? Like it takes place in the present, but that's part of the backstory?
That's some of the backstory, yes.
Okay.
And
This is off topic for a minute, but have you seen Midnight Mass?
yes, I have.
Okay. Would you say it's in any way related to kind of the theme of that story?
Yeah, there are some similarities. But there were all kinds of. I wanted to write a vampire story, but I wanted to write a vampire story that was different. And of course, every vampire writer is going to say that. There are expectations, and then there are things. How can I twist this to make it my own? And so once I figured out that that instrument or that thing that makes the vampires different than other vampires and other stories and movies and such. Once I figured that out, then I had to figure out where did that come from, and then where did that come from, and I kept going back, and then it kind of I kind of focused on Uruk and Gilgamesh. There are all kinds of different aspects of the story that come into play later on when these two protagonists start discovering where they stand in this whole grand scheme of things. because this is an ancient story actually that just happens to come to a conclusion in 2008.
Well, there are so many different vampire stories. I mean, you have the classic Dracula, you have Interview with the Vampire, you have The Strain, you have Salem's Lot, you have Van Helsing.
Right.
It's like there's a bunch of different ways of telling it, and they're all interesting. They're just
Right.
slightly different takes.
Right. So I had to, a long time ago when I was in college, and I read this, long ago and far away, right? I read this story in a world lit class, uh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I was kind of shocked as well. Well, how have I gone this far in my life and not heard of this before? Because it's this kind of a seminal piece of literature that's had a lot of influence on um, world lit in general. So,
A lot of people say it had a lot of influence on the early Bible as well.
right. Well, yeah, and there's all kinds of interconnected things that I have woven in with dealing with early early Old Testament events that kind of play a part in what happens in 2008 in the story. But again, I don't want to give, I'm sitting here saying this now, and it may not even come to pass when I get to that particular point in the story. But there are, and again, this might be something that Lexi's like, John, is it really important to the overarching narrative of the story? I mean, is it that important?
Well, I really like the idea of bringing like ancient legends and stuff into it.
Right.
That I think that really strengthens it.
Well, here's the thing. So at one point, I'm in the middle of writing this story, and this is like in the first early drafts, and I come across this. I can't even remember how I came across it. It's called the Bernie Relief, or the Queen of the Night Relief. It's also called, and it's in the British Museum in London. And it's this little plaque. I mean, it's not it. You see these pictures of it, and you get this idea that it's this large thing, but it's not. It's just this small little plaque. It's only about yay big, and it's got this kind of demonic figure on it with these wings, and there's a lot of mystery as to where it came from, and its provenance is not entirely clear. Where did it come from? Who did it really
Who currently holds this? Like who owns it?
It's at the British Museum.
Okay.
They eventually purchased it, but for a long time they refused to because they couldn't. Its provenance was not clear, and they don't want to necessarily, purchase things that may have been stolen or fabricated or whatever. But anyway, I just fell in love with this form on this figure, this goddess that's on this relief. And it's either Lilith or Ishtar or Ishtar's sister Ereshkigal. I think that's how you pronounce it. But anyway, no one's entirely clear what this thing is, where it came from, what it means. It's kind of a mix of different iconic imagery on it. But it just, for some reason, it captured my attention. And my wife's English, so we go to England, at least we try to at least once a year, except of course during COVID. But the first time we went over, I said, I got to go to the British Museum. I got to go see this thing. And I went in there. I have pictures of myself with it, and I'm like, yeah, look at this, and all that
Would
kind
they
of
let
stuff.
you hold it?
No. It's
No.
behind. Actually,
Okay.
my guess is that it's not even the real thing that's in the case. I imagine
Oh, the real ones in the Vatican.
it's probably
They have
yeah,
everything there.
yeah. So there was just something about this form on this plaque, and I ended up writing that into the story later on in the series. This plaque, this figure on the plaque, who it is, what it is, um, that became a major question for me to try to explore, and it ended up becoming a major reason for why this why these creatures are roaming the earth right now, um, and why they have chosen Angelique Carlson to be their champion and to bring back the Queen of the Night. Which and then basically that's what this whole thing's about, is bringing back the Queen of the Night. John and his forces of light are trying to thwart that, and there's of course going to be a huge battle between light and darkness at the end of the book, and we'll just have to see how things uh,
Play out.
resolve. Yeah. So
So what got you into this? Because this is obviously like very old school horror inspired. Um, were you like were you always attracted to the dark side? You like horror
oh,
fiction?
well, I've always been a mystery thriller kind of person, and my wife and I watch all kinds of police procedurals and that sort of thing. We like a good mystery and a good thriller. But early on, I was a science fiction fan. I've always been a sci-fi fan. I'm on the Trek side of that conflict. Not that I don't like Star Wars. I do like Star Wars, but my heart has always been with Star Trek. So I like hard science fiction, and I grew up with, War of the Worlds and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and all those sorts of hardcore sci-fi stories. And as a boy, I just gobbled those
Did
up.
you watch The Expanse?
Oh, I love that. That was a
Yeah,
great show.
great
Love that
show.
show. Great show. Um, so consequently, growing up watching those movies, Fantastic Voyage, I remember thinking about how cool would it be to miniaturize yourself and put yourself into someone else's body. I mean, I thought that movie was awesome, and then when I read the book, it was even more awesome. Planet of the Apes. I mean, all these things I grew up with as a young man, as a boy, um, and they kind of molded me, kept turning me a little more, little more toward the fantasy side, because it became, to me, and I'm probably going to get all kinds of nasty comments, but I think science fiction is basically just a different form of fantasy. Fantasy is an overarching genre that employs all these other aspects: science fiction, mythology, horror, all that kind of goes into under this umbrella called fantasy. And people might disagree with me, but that's just my perspective on it.
Well, I think you can't simplify stuff and like give strict guidelines, but I mean, it definitely helps you categorize stuff. Like Conan the Barbarian is not nearly the same as, like, say, Star Wars, which is also not
Oh
nearly
yeah,
the same as like Alien.
right.
So some like Alien would be like sci-fi horror, or Event Horizon would be sci-fi horror. But I think both are appropriate in those cases.
Right. So yeah, I was this hardcore sci-fi fan as a young boy growing up, we had this show here in Pittsburgh called Chiller Theater, and Bill Cardell, his uh, nickname was Chilly Billy. And Friday nights, I think it was Friday nights and Saturday nights, I can't remember, but anyway, he showed all these old horror films, and I remember seeing Christopher Lee as Dracula for the first time, and I thought, how cool would that be to be a vampire? So this whole idea of vampires started playing into my young life, and so that kind of opened up the whole fantasy side. I started getting more into um, comic books that dealt with the fantastical themes, like The Tomb of Dracula and Werewolf by Night, and what else? Geez, um,
Did you read Swamp Thing? I thought that
Swamp
was an
Thing.
amazing art team, and
Yeah,
Alan
yeah.
Moore is an amazing writer.
So I had so I started kind of had this duality. I had hardcore science fiction, and I had the hardcore high fantasy. I started getting more into. I remember reading The Hobbit in high school, um, and just being just blown away by this whole idea of dragons and elves and all that kind of stuff. I never really grew up with that. It was all basically science fiction, you know, the Andromeda Strain and the Omega Man, and gosh, I can just go on forever. Soylent Green, uh, all these
John Green is
movies,
made of people. Is
yeah,
people. Yeah.
all these movies had a seminal kind of, of effect on me that when I then went into the fantasy side of things, I looked for ways of comparing and contrasting fantasy and science fiction. Well, you've got a technology on one side and you've got magic on the other. How are those different? They're just treated differently, but in a kind of an overarching fantasy kind of way. So anyway, long
Well,
story
people
short,
love the little technical limitations. Like people say, Star Wars isn't sci-fi. Star Wars is like fantasy because they have the lightsabers and the Force and
right,
stuff like that. So
right.
yeah, people.
Yeah,
I think you can kind of have a more broad look at stuff.
right, and so I don't like to when you look at something like 2001: A Space Odyssey.
It's also a great movie.
Yeah,
Stanley
you
Kubrick is my favorite director of all
right.
time.
You can't say anything other than that is a science fiction story.
Mhm.
Whereas when you look at, for instance, like you mentioned, Star Wars, you know, is that a science fiction story? If you're going to hold it up against 2001, then you kind of have to say not really. Um, so then how do you classify that? Um,
More of a drama and thriller, maybe.
um, or fantasy? I mean, science fantasy. Um, I, you know, I, you know,
Well, I don't know if there's a whole lot of science in Star
it,
Wars.
in Star Wars,
I
yeah.
mean,
Other
it's
than
entertaining. I like the early Star Wars a lot, but I wouldn't say there's a lot of science in there.
right. Other than ships, and they talk, have their little techno babble every once in a while,
But
dealing
even the ships don't follow some of the basic rules of,
right.
of
So, so,
thermodynamics and science and gravity and so on. Yeah,
so what do you do? How do you classify that? Sometimes I just don't even like to classify it at all. So you know what? It's a good story,
right,
and leave it at that.
right,
And if you don't like lightsabers and strange aliens and space battles, then don't watch it.
right.
You know.
Well, I think people are more critical of like modern mythology than like I love the Norse myths, I love the Greek myths. Like if
Mm,
you read those old myths and you're like, nobody goes, wait a minute, do dragons really look like that? They go, oh, it makes a good story. So yeah,
right.
I think people can be hypercritical.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, um, I grew up with this whole science fiction fantasy part, and I read voraciously. Even though I'm a slow reader, I read all the time. And at some point, and I forget who said it long ago and far away, someone at one point said, at some point you read so much that you want to write a story. You want to do it yourself. And that's what I did. As and this was in the fifth grade. by the way. So I was what, 11 years old or whatever, 11, 12. I wrote this story. It was kind of like a ripoff of the War of the Worlds, because at that time that was like my favorite story. And I loved the old movie, the old 50, I forget what, 52, 3 or whatever, whenever that old
I've seen
movie
it
came
though.
out.
It's good. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I love that movie. I had read an abridged version of the book as a kid. I just loved. There were some comic books out at the time that dealt with the War of the Worlds, and I couldn't have enough of War of the Worlds, and so I wanted to write my own War of the Worlds like story. And of course, our teacher assigned us, want you to write a story, and that's what I did. I wrote this story called Earth Invaded. In fact, I went down this morning and found. So my cousin Nancy Cranwell printed this up. She printed like 20 copies for me after I got the standing ovation from my classmates after the teacher read it. So that was my first taste of being published or seeing my name on the cover of something. But at some point you just want to start writing your own stories. I think you absorb so much about writing when you're actually reading that your story, the things that you start dreaming about start coming out of you as a story. And so I went through my early years writing little stories, taking comic books. That was one of the things. I think I learned how to write dialogue from comic books, because I would take a comic book and rewrite it onto a page, employing all the, what I saw on the page, and using the dialogue tags and that sort of thing, and using the actual dialogue that was in the comic book. And I think I learned how to write dialogue by imitating comic books. And I had this huge notebook full of all this stuff. I mean, it was massive. And I lost it. I have no idea what happened to it. One day I had it, the next day I didn't. I don't know what happened, where it went. I retraced all my my path the previous day, the library, everywhere, wherever I'd gone that previous day. I retraced everything, could not find it. Was heartbroken. And this was right before I went into high school. So I had this kind of rich history of exploring writing on my own and reading and all these movies and horror and science fiction and fantasy. And then I lost that notebook and I thought, F it, I'm done with it. I'm going to chase girls and drink beer. And that's basically what I did in high school. So, and then in college, it came back to me. And once I switched my major to English and secondary education and started having to explore what fiction really is, and the various types, the different modes of discourse and that sort of thing. And I discovered Dungeons and Dragons in college too. That was another big influence on me. I started writing down the encounters and the events of our characters from our D&D episodes. And I kind of rediscovered writing after that particular point, and I started coming up with my own story, dealing with, and it was a hard fantasy story called Dragonheart. And I was in the middle of writing all that until that bloody movie came out. And that kind of ruined things for me a little bit, because they took my title. I was totally upset with that. So they took my title. And so I gave up writing for a little while after that. And plus life happens, I had kids and got married, had twin boys, was starting a profession. I was becoming a teacher and all that kind of stuff. So years later, I ended up in class one day when I was teaching. I wrote a little story about this girl and this vampire. It was a lot like Interview with the Vampire, Rice's novel. But that was the kernel story that ended up about a decade after that becoming the kernel story of the Dark Matter series. So that, it's a kind of a roller coaster ride. I'm heading up, I'm doing all this writing, then something happens, I lose that notebook. Then, I start writing again. And then all of a sudden, life happens and I have kids and a profession and I've got to grade those papers and I just don't have any time for writing.
No, I understand. I mean, life is a rocky road.
Yeah.
Like I had brain cancer. My wife died in a hit and
Wow.
run. Like stuff comes up. But if you're dedicated to something, I think you push
Right.
through and you manage to get it out. But all right, man. Let's call into this. So how can people get a hold of you? How can they see your work?
The first novel, like I said, came out in last June, The Dark Stirs. You can find it at Courage Publishing. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the usual suspects. The second book, I'm in the middle of revising that, The Dark Gambit. You can find me, I have a website, johnpwallman.com. I'm on Facebook, John P. Wallman, author. I'm on Instagram, author John P. Wallman. I have a newsletter. So if you go to my website, you can sign up for the newsletter. I have another newsletter coming out pretty soon.
Give a shout out to your website.
johnpwallman.com. It lists, I have a blog on there. I have a little bit about my backstory of who I am and some of the things I believe in, a lot of comments about different things in my life and different things going on around the world. So I haven't made many updates to that site. I have a lot of stuff that I have to give to them to do, but that's another part of this whole publishing thing that no one tells you about, the author platform. But yeah, it's been fun. It's been a lot of hard work, but I've really enjoyed this whole ride, and I'm going to enjoy watching each of these books come to life, and hopefully help bring a little entertainment to the public in the process.
Where do they find this? You can find it on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles.
Barnes and Noble. You can go to my website actually, and and you find the book, and you can click the book. It'll take you right to my publisher's page to order the book. So yeah, it's offered in most online bookstores that.
Oh, thanks, man. Is there anything else you want to give a shout out to? Anything that you want to mention?
I want to mention, and this is on the dedication page of my first book, The Dark Stirs. There are two Deborahs in my life. Debra, Deborah Pfeiffer. She's the one that got me started on re-examining this whole Angelique Carlson storyline and got me started. And then my wife, Deborah, Deborah, so two different Deborahs. She's my wife, and she's really kept me going. She's been such a staunch supporter of everything that I've been doing with this. My biggest cheerleader, but that kind of puts her on the sidelines. She's not really a cheerleader. She's been my partner through this whole thing. And so, those two Deborahs, my good friend Deborah Pfeiffer, my wife Deborah Wallman, those two Deborahs have been extremely important in this whole authoring journey that I've been on for the last almost 15 years now.